as, as they arrive onto the Zoom. So, colleagues, good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, dependent upon where you are in the world. You're all very welcome. I'm Helen Gunter, Professor Emerita at the University of Manchester, UK, and I'm pleased to be chairing today's session. The session, as you can see, is being recorded. So that's for Belmas to share with Belmas members who are not able to attend today. Would you please put your microphone on mute so that if there are any interruptions, they won't follow through into the session or into the recording. Colleagues, I'm delighted to introduce to you Dr. Jill Perry from the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh. You're very welcome, Jill, to speak today to Belmas members. Jill's research that she's going to talk about today is focused on professional doctorates, and in particular, she's interested in how education professionals use research evidence in relation to their practice. And I think, as Peter would attest, both Peter and I worked on an EdD, that is a really crucial question that we need to keep addressing. Notably, Jill is Executive Director of the Carnegie project on the Education Doctorate, and that's a consortium of 165 universities in the US, Canada, and Ireland. And I think that's a very fascinating collaboration, and I look forward to hearing more about it. Jill is going to talk to us about this project, the framework and doctoral preparation in relation to scholarly practitioners. She's also put some links in the chat so you can follow things up, particularly to her to the journal that they have. And also, would you please put any questions into the chat so that I can follow that up later? So just a reminder, please put your mute onto your microphone. Thank you. So Jill is going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we will take questions for about 15 minutes.
Let me help you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Excuse me, would you, Rupert? Thank you. Um, so, yeah, put your questions in the chat. So, Jill, you're very welcome. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Helen, and welcome everybody. Good day to everyone, depending on where you are. It's morning for me, coming from the East Coast of the United States. I'm delighted to be here. I've had the opportunity to attend, I think now about 4 Belmas conferences, and have always had a lovely experience. Many of our CPED members attend the Belmas conference and are members of Belmas as well. So I'm excited to see this collaboration, and I'm also excited to tell you a little bit today about the Carnegie Project on the Education Doctorate. So as Helen mentioned, I am the executive director of this project. I've been with it since its inception for about 18 years now. And I am also what we call a professor of practice at the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh. And I should add my third title in there. I've recently become the director of our EDD or EdD program at the University of Pittsburgh yet. So I'm a busy gal, but a lot of it's focused on the EDD, which I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today. So I have an agenda. My goal is to kind of give you a little bit of a history of the EDD and then the rise of CPED as its role in distinguishing the EDD, and then really how we do that around this idea of a scholarly practitioner. I was delighted, I guess 2 weeks ago, I was at the UCEA conference in Puerto Rico where Deb Oathwaite was there, and we were at a similar session focused on professors of practice, and she said, you know, we just don't have this language, professor of practice, scholarly practitioner over in the UK. And so I'm excited to hear you talk about it. So I hope what I can do for you in the next 40 or so minutes is to give you a bit of an overview and then open to questions. I start all of my sessions with these 3 quotes simply because it reminds me why I continue to do the work that I do. But for those of you who are not located in the United States, these are quotes that I've gathered over the years from practitioners who work in either K-12 education or higher education, who have circumstances that have required them to go back for their professional advancement to get a doctorate. And these quotes are their reflections on looking for preparation that should support them in their needs and growing as practitioners, but ultimately have run into the PhD EDD divide that has plagued our country particularly, and wondering what is going to be the best degree to advance them in their careers, but at the same time, give them the actual skills that they need to do their job. And the bottom one is my favorite one because she says, if I could get a similar level education to a medical doctor, I would be pleased. And that really grounds what CPED has focused on is how do we parse out the EDD as a professional doctorate, separate from the PhD, but also equal in stature and rigor. The history of the EDD is grounded here in the United States back in the 1900s when many professions, law and medicine in particular, and education, wanted to become more formalized. So they were associating themselves with with universities. Education got taken up at Harvard University, working with Henry Holmes, where he created the Graduate School of Education for two real purposes. One was to become independent from arts and sciences, which over here was the only place that could award a PhD in a university. And then also to create this doctorate, where at the time schools were growing in the Boston area, and um, many schools were run by principals who were largely women. And he was looking to create a role that was above the female role of principals, what we now know in the United States as superintendent. So he wanted to create a credential specifically for men who could oversee schools in the Boston area because at that time, Harvard established largely the curriculum for education, K-12 education, and then they would disseminate it into the schools. So he thought this would be a great idea to do that. He got some money from the Carnegie Foundation to create the Graduate School of Education and to begin this EDD, which then proliferated around the country. But by 1930, not even 10 years later, we already saw studies that were showing that there was really no distinction between the EDD and the PhD. And that was because Henry Holmes himself did not have a doctorate, did not really know what kinds of skills a practitioner or leader in education needed. And so he largely took the faculty and the program from the School of Arts and Sciences in the PhD and reduced the number of credits. So he reduced the need for language study, he reduced the number of research credits, he reduced or he shifted the type of dissertations they could do to more practice-oriented dissertations. So the design of the EDD was really established by withdraw of credits, right? So it became by subtraction. And so it really became from the beginning less than the PhD and really held on to that title. As you see, over the years from there on out, many academic studies took place trying to understand what the difference between these degrees were. We saw a lot of discussion that said eliminate one or the other, keep them both, eliminate them both, come up with some kind of MBA style degree. And so the discussion, largely academic, went on over and over throughout history. In the early 2000s, in the United States, it became a huge debate. What do we mean by the EDD? We had the Council of Graduate Schools here was doing a study on professional doctorates. Our AERA, our American Education Research Association, was trying to understand where the PhD in education fit and was trying to get rid of the EDD. And lots of other things were happening, particularly at the Carnegie Foundation. They were trying to study what it means to prepare practitioners in fields like law, medicine, nursing, clergy. At the same time, they were understanding what it means to prepare people who have PhDs in history, education, philosophy, and other areas. And education was the only one that spanned both of those. And so they were trying to say, we need to understand what we mean by education. What we knew at the time, and as we looked at that, was here, people who went into schools of education, graduate schools of education, were not coming out trying to get faculty positions. They were staying in practice. And so one of our data points early on was, where are these people going? What are they coming to study? You saw a lot of superintendents, a lot of educational leaders and PhD programs who are being trained in very rigorous research ways that resulted in a hoop jumping exercise to get a doctorate and a dissertation that largely sat on a shelf and collected a lot of dust. And so while students were learning things, they weren't necessarily learning things that could be applied in practice. One of our other data points here in the US is we started to look at job descriptions. And trying to understand folks who are going into, we still have tenure in this country, sadly, tenure line faculty positions versus those who are remaining in professional practice. So if you look at these job descriptions, you see an assistant professor has very specific skills that they need to work in a tenure line professor role. Whereas those who are going to work in K-12 and reach the level of superintendency, or those who want a vice president or a vice chancellor type role in higher education, have very different skills. Yet historically, we were training them the same in the same kinds of classes, largely focused on the design for how you would prepare people to become faculty and professors. When we started to think about how could we distinguish these things, we looked to the Council of Graduate Schools here in the United States. Their report in 2007 that focused on the professional practice doctorate really outlined this idea that it could not be just like a PhD with a one size fits all. Education is very broad, very different. And so we had to think about what does that look like? And the really neat thing was that they noted this idea that the doctorate being the ultimate degree in education or in any field should prepare somebody to be transformational, whether that's transformational in their discipline with a PhD or transformational in the field of practice that they work in. So we held on to these ideas as we went into CPED. And the Carnegie Project on the Education Doctorate, which started in 2007, only had 25 institutions. And our goal was really to take 3 years to distinguish the degree and to come back and say this is what an EDD is. But for those of you who work in education, and particularly in universities, know that change does not happen that quickly. And so it has taken, and still is, we're working on it 18 years later, really understanding what the distinction between those degrees were. What we knew early on is that we wanted to distinguish it from the PhD, that it was a professional degree that would prepare people to be scholarly practitioners, which I'll talk about, applying inquiry and research to change and improve practice. We came up with a framework, which I'll also discuss, as we learned that because education is so varied, it's higher ed, it's K-12, it's nonprofit, it's different levels within there, different skills are needed, that we really couldn't come up with a one-size-fits-all medical model, which our founder, Lee Schulman, had asked us to do. We had to think differently about what kind of guidelines could we provide that would allow people to design programs, but be geared towards the kinds of students they were training, but also geared towards their local university context, because we do not have a centralized education system here in the US. Universities are very different in the way that they are run and the kinds of rules and guidelines that they have. So here we are in 2025, nearing the end of 2025, and we have about 165 or 166 institutions in the United States, in Canada, and in Ireland. And we've worked with countries, New Zealand, Israel, even the UK, on what we mean by this doctorate. So what we've learned over time largely is through language. We've changed a lot of the language around these degrees, which you'll hear me talk about. We've shifted the degree time. These programs are largely 2.5 to 3 years, maybe 4 years. They often are cohort model where students come in together, they stay together, and they go through the program together. They are largely fully online or hybrid. And they focus on this idea of preparing people to use inquiry in professional practice. The dissertation, I'll talk a lot about that, is focused into the program. So it's completed alongside the coursework. And then it's geared towards, rather than creating generalizable knowledge or contributing to the knowledge base, as you would see more in PhD type programs, it's teaching people how to apply research to improve localized practice. So those are sort of the big ideas around CPED, and I will talk about those going forward. One of the other areas we looked at, the University Council of Education Administration, UCEA, which I believe is BELMAS's sister organization here, had published something early on looking at the components of doctoral programs and trying to understand the distinction between those. And you'll see, particularly around the notion of a capstone or dissertation, has been the most contentious area because we've largely not understood what do we mean by a dissertation for these programs. On a side note, one of the reasons we have a dissertation in any form of education is because Education is not a formalized profession in our country, and we do not have any kind of licensure body in the way that law and medicine do. And so the dissertation serves both at the PhD level and the EDD level as that sort of final test to prove that you can do the skills that you've been taught. And what is unique about that is historically we've not thought that way in distinguishing these two degrees. And when Lee Shulman created our organization, he did it so that we could really pull all those practitioners out of the program, out of the PhD program, and then begin to think more strongly about how we better prepare PhD students while EDD students were being prepared in ways that was more useful to them. CPED's framework was our result. Our first original 25 institutional members came together and said, if we're not going to do a one-size-fits-all model, how do we do that? What do we do? And so we created, down here, you'll see on the bottom, our 6 principles. Those are the guiding principles, really, like I call it the foundation of any program. Any kind of EdD program could fit into these 6 principles, and it'll allow for types of students, types of faculty teaching in programs, institutional barriers or policies, and localized context and needs. Building on top of that foundation, we had a set of design concepts. Lee Shulman gave us 2 of these, laboratories of practice and signature pedagogy. And then we've built the other ones as we've gone forward. These are the key components that help build and design a program. I'll talk a little bit more about some of those. And then ultimately, because we knew that language mattered, if you continue to talk PhD language, then people will continually think about EDD programs with that mindset. So we came up with a new definition of what we think the EDD is to help shift thinking around that. We also immediately said that these programs are geared towards preparing people who want to remain in practice in these kinds of roles, whether it be higher ed, other kinds of organizations, or K-12 education. It is not to prepare people to be professors or researchers, not to be experts in any discipline or content area. It is also not a catch-all credential, which when we started, we saw a lot of that. People who wanted some kind of doctorate and 3 little letters behind their name would sign up for these programs and come out. And it's also not meant to be less than a PhD or a PhD light. So we all agreed on that as we came into these programs. Now, how does that framework, which seems kind of complex, turn into developing professional practice doctorates? We have thought about that in many different ways and have come up with these ideas of backwards mapping programs. So when you think about PhD programs traditionally in the United States, where students have to do a lot of coursework before they go on to the dissertation, you've seen where you have a group of faculty where someone might teach research skills, someone might teach policy, someone might teach the history, someone might teach case studies, and you say, well, we'll bring all that together and we'll make that a PhD in educational studies. With an EDD, you have to be much more succinct about what you want them to do in those programs, in the same way that medical and law education are succinct. So we do that by thinking about the end first. What is it we want these students to learn in these programs, and what does that look like in terms of local practitioner needs, the expertise of our faculty, the uniqueness of our university? And then how do we create those learning outcomes in a way that we are sure, as we map that back down through the dissertation experience, the curriculum designs, and right into our admissions process, we are sure that we are bringing the right people in and we can prepare them in ways that they will reach those student learning outcomes. So what that looks like is kind of this mapping process that I've got here. You start with what the student learning outcomes. Who do we want these people to be? And that looks very different depending on if you're preparing higher ed people, if you're preparing K-12 people, if you're in education generally. And then thinking about that, how are we sure that the dissertation represents that they've met those skills? How are we sure that we are developing the core knowledge in concentration courses, inquiry courses, and foundation courses? And then, like I said, that goes all the way down into admissions, because you can't bring in a 3rd grade teacher who's had no real leadership experience and put them in a classroom with somebody who has been a principal for 15 years and expect them to come out at the end of the program in the same way. So being very intentional about admissions. CPED thinks of those student learning outcomes as this idea of a scholarly practitioner. And this is our definition of a scholarly practitioner. And again, we are broad in that because we want each institution to own and customize this definition to fit their own institutions. But the broad ideas are that they're learning how to take the practical knowledge that they've had. Many of these people coming into these programs are older. They have many years of experience. They're looking to take that experience and use it towards advancing their own skills. So we want them to take that knowledge, combine it with what we know as faculty as literature, research tools, theory, and bring those two together in a marrying in a way that these people know how to take that and apply it to practice. We also have this idea that they are doing it in ways to improve educational settings through understanding of equity and justice, that they also understand that the ultimate products they develop in their work is not just a dissertation, but are things that can be disseminated in different ways to the kinds of stakeholders that they are beholden to in their leadership positions. And ultimately, folks that work in practice don't work alone. They work in groups, they work with other stakeholders, they work with other practitioners. So teaching them how to do this work with the input of these folks. So the scholarly practitioner is the end product or the end goal of EDD programs in according to CPED. I hope I can show this video and it works well. Let's see. It worked before I got on. Oh, here we go.
Scholarly practitioner to me means a person who never stops learning.
It means someone who is engaged in improvement inquiry.
I'd say every time I think about a scholarly practitioner, it makes me imagine a superhero of a kind.
CPED has the definition, which is a pretty extensive definition about what we mean by scholar practitioner. But for me, it's always been the outcome of our program. It's the graduate who we're aspiring towards with these programs. And so we want to be able to honor the practice that people do, their strong practitioner abilities and skills that they already have, and merge that together with this idea of scholarship as a tool.
The community engagement, that's the practitioner piece. And the scholarly piece for me, has become this ability to think more broadly, to think more critically. I'm thinking about theories, right? And how theories can support sometimes what, as a practitioner, intuitively, but when you marry that intuition to research and theory, then it becomes scholarly.
I got really excited when I started seeing EDD programs and hearing language of scholar practitioner because I'm a mental health counselor and I was working on the front line of mental health and I was interested in doctoral work, but the PhDs didn't quite fit for me. I learned so much from working that I wanted something where I could be a practitioner and doing my work and learning through that, but also grounded in scholarship. It's allowed people like me that are out on the front lines working to engage in doctoral level education and research with our diverse practical experience and skill sets. And it's a game changer, in my opinion.
I love that. I love hearing from practitioners who've gone through these programs because you really see the difference that it's made in their own practice and in their work. So as I said, the dissertation, we call it a dissertation in practice, and that was because originally we started with capstone, but here in the United States, capstone projects tend to happen at the undergraduate level. And so we tried to come up with something, it was one of those, we will give you $1,000 if you come up with a very unique name. And that didn't work either, because what we found is many institutions, their graduate schools wouldn't let them remove that language of dissertation. So we settled on dissertation in practice as a broad understanding that this means that a dissertation is applied. And I'll show that definition in a minute. But as we backwards map, this is the point where we really know, have we taught people what we expected them to have in terms of student learning outcomes? So the dissertation has really become both one of the most important pieces of the designs of these programs, but also one of the most contentious. As many faculty have gone through traditional 5-chapter dissertations, they really don't understand what we mean by that. So we've done a lot of work to help people understand that. We started with trying to understand the differences, the purpose of each component of a dissertation. We've seen people who've done radically different looking dissertations, but largely dissertations still follow the same 5-chapter format. And so when we think about that, we have to think about the pieces inside that 5-chapter and how does that look different? What is the purpose that it serves? So when we think about methodologies, for example, we're not doing phenomenology or narrative inquiries necessarily. We want to see applied inquiry like action research, improvement science, evaluation. Now, all of this is to say not all of our institutions follow what we do. We are not an accreditation body. We are not a mandating body. We simply have framework and guidelines that we are trying to help our members understand so that the EDD as a degree writ large can change. So we still see phenomenology and narrative inquiry and things like that. But we push back on that and try and help folks understand that practitioners need to learn how to apply those skills to practice beyond the dissertation, and that the dissertation really is their pilot study or their cadaver, if you will. It's the place they get to practice, right? But going forward, you want them to be able to say, here's a new problem I'm looking at. What do I do now? Oh, let me go see what the literature says about this to broaden my understanding about that problem. Let me think about doing some quick surveys or data gathering to understand how stakeholders are experiencing this problem. Let me go out and organize a small study to see if this change idea might have an impact. So you're teaching them how to do this long beyond the dissertation. And so the dissertation serves as a place that is less high stakes and more about practice than it is about making sure they contribute to some knowledge body. I think the best person that's written about this is Doug Archibald, who formalized a piece on the problem-based, he called it thesis, not dissertation, back in 2008, where he tried to map out what do we mean by this? And he talks about defining a problem, right? This idea that you're trying to persuade, which is also another practitioner skill, persuade others that this problem exists and that we need to do something about it, that we need to situate that problem not only in the literature, but contextually so people can see that it is a problem that is existing and harmful. And that the work that you do to investigate it may go beyond just a simple hypothesis, that you're going to ask a lot of questions, you're going to try and fix it through testing solutions, and that ultimately the result is not just a 5-chapter dissertation, it's all these other products that you bring back to share in your organization, to support others learning about that problem. What that looks like in CPED is this equation that I developed where the dissertation is focused on a problem of practice, which you'll see here is not only persistent, but it is contextualized, something that is in the work of the practitioner that is also connected to the literature. It's not a unique problem, but it is something they see in the literature that gets played out in practice. They're going to tie that to inquiry as practice. So rather than going with traditional language, quantitative one, qualitative one, phenomenology courses or case study, we wanted to call research courses something different. Again, language matters. Inquiry is practice. So teaching them how to do that inquiry as practice beyond the dissertation, which results in a dissertation in practice that we call a scholarly endeavor, because we do not want to remove the notion of rigorous scholarship, but actually enhance that idea, and that it will impact that complex problem of practice in their location. So ultimately, the dissertation, if you go back to my map where I talked about it having to demonstrate that they've reached those student learning outcomes, the idea is that we've taught them how to apply research and inquiry to address problems in their practice beyond the dissertation, and that you can see that they've met those student learning outcomes. So in that way, the dissertation becomes that sort of final licensing action that they do, right? The final exam that they take to show that they know how to use these skills. An example of thinking about the interior of a dissertation as different, you can see traditional PhDs' use of literature, right? They're looking for a gap in the literature. They're trying to find where they can contribute to the scholarly knowledge as they're designing their program or their career, moving into moving into a professor position. Whereas in EDD, they don't need to contribute to the literature. They don't need to read everything and find the gap where they're going to fit. They need to see the literature as a tool that can help them understand a problem better. Harvard, in their EDLD, which they now call their program, back in 2012, they shifted their EDD to a PhD because they realized that it was a research doctorate. And then they created something called the EDLD, which is an education doctorate in leadership. Essentially, it's an EDD. They call their use of literature review of knowledge for action, which I love because I think that really says clearly that literature is a tool that practitioners can use again and again to help broaden their understanding beyond their own practitioner understanding to know what is going on with a problem. But they don't need to read everything about what is going on with that problem, right? Enough to help them contextualize and understand what's happening in their setting. So for me, what that looks like with literature, I'm going to give you an example. This picture is fictitious, but the story is real. One of our members, University of Connecticut, had a respected leader, somebody who had been a superintendent for 25 years, but who had never gone back to get a doctorate. This person was known all over the country, and when he was brought into the classroom, they said to him, "What's a problem that you struggle with?" He said, "Instructional leadership." And they said, "Well, how would you fix that?" And he came up with something very similar here, just sort of a list, A, B, C, D. This is what you would do. Now, somebody with that kind of practitioner experience would know what to do, and people would say, "Sure, that's what we need to do." So the faculty there said, how do we take these people who are largely smarter than we are in what they're doing in their own practice and actually make them better? So they had a signature pedagogy, which was called Theory to Practice Inquiry, where every semester they introduced theory on the topic that the student was interested. So in this case, instructional leadership outcomes. They said, go read a whole bunch about that and then go back into your practice and do something with that knowledge. So they were taking theory and then they were doing mini laboratories of practice where they were trying something out in their setting. And then they'd have to report on that experience in a review each semester. And that went on for 4 semesters and it led towards their final, they called it a capstone project. It led towards their final project. But in this particular person, who was fairly certain on who he was and what he would do based on his practitioner knowledge, spent a semester reading about research and trying something out. And what they asked them to do is to then mind map your thinking, to go beyond that ABCD list. This is what he came up with after he spent a semester getting into the literature to understand what he might do in practice. That's significant when you think about that. How you can take somebody who is a very strong practitioner, introduce them to the kind of knowledge that we work with every day as faculty, and see how that impacts their own thinking about practice. Not for contributing to literature, but thinking about how they can improve practice after digging into literature. That is profound to me. Another space that you get into is this idea of what are we doing for core knowledge? How are we building that core knowledge? And what I just showed you is an example of that. But the CPED framework can dig deeper into some of our building blocks, can help you design foundation courses, inquiry courses, concentration or major area courses. And then the work that they do, their milestones, whether that be comprehensive exams or dissertations in practice, really should be formative and teaching them hands-on. This is how you do it. In the same way that surgeons learn how to sew on bananas, we need to show folks how to practice this in practice as opposed to penalizing them and making them prove to us that they know the research. We're partners in their learning in that way. The kinds of people who teach in these programs, I thought of this after I talked to Deb at UCEA last week. And we mentioned some of our language of folks who are in these teaching in these programs. It takes a village, right? PhDs cannot teach EDDs only because they've not had the same kind of practitioner experience. So we do have tenured PhD faculty that teach, a lot of them, but we also have professors of practice like myself and others who come from practice who teach in these programs. And often we have actual practitioners teaching in programs, whether they're graduates from the programs or they're local superintendents that have partnerships with schools. So they have that sort of 360 teaching method where people can provide all different experiences. Those practitioners often land on dissertation and practice committees as well. Many committees are 3 people in size. They have the chair of the committee, they have another faculty member, and then they have a practitioner who can speak to that practitioner experience. So as I sort of wind down here, just to point out some of the key points with the EDD is that the EDD is different. It's not only different from the PhD, but it is different by different context and local needs. So faculty need to think about what they know how to teach. I've had a lot of faculty say to me, well, just tell me how Harvard does it. I want to do like that. And I have to say, well, you're not Harvard. But let's think about who you are and what skills your faculty bring. If you want to teach action research in your program, you need faculty who know how to do action research. If you want to teach critical race theory, you need people who know how to do that, right? So let's think about the faculty expertise as we're designing this program. Let's think about the needs of the local students who are coming to the program. Let's think about the kind of institution you are, religious, private, public, and how that impacts it. So determining who those student learning outcomes are really can shape the rest of the program and help you build that in so that you have a very succinct and woven program that you're moving a whole cohort through. And then again, that all the assessments that you do are formative as you're teaching them the how-tos and not punitive. And that ultimately our CPED framework can guide a lot of the work that people are doing. We've spent 18 years, starting with 25 institutions, now up to 165. We have learned a lot. So we have a lot of tools that can support that. Those tools come in the form of our book series. The middle book there, which is mine, really goes over that whole backwards mapping process that I just discussed. But we have a lot of books that focus on what do we mean by dissertation and practice? What do we mean by scholarly practitioner? How do we get people through these programs? What does it mean for applied research? This is just a sampling. Our book series, I put in the link up there if you want to have a look at those. We also have an online free open source journal that is, we started in 2016, so it's almost 10 years old. And our latest issue has just come out. We have several issues that focus on the dissertation and practice, but also on different aspects of program design. So anybody can jump in and grab that. Now, as I end, because I started with those quotes, I like to end with quotes that I've gotten from students who have gone through these programs, who have really expressed how that experience, not only by the end of the program, but really in the middle of the program, right in the beginning, as they've started to focus on problems in their context and learning on how to address those, have come out saying that these programs have changed the way I do my work and have really advanced me as a practitioner. All right, there you go. Thank you so much. I am open to questions.
Thank you so much, Jill. That was a very detailed and interesting explanation of the project that you've been involved in over time. Now, we've got some questions in the chat, so I'm going to take Steve's first. Steve Willoughby.
Thanks very much. Yes, I went and did an EDD actually in London at the Institute of Education, and I finished that all quite a few years ago. There were real positive things about it because it meant that people were together for a couple of years, and they were from different areas. There were doctors, there were people like myself from education and so on. That was all positive. But I think the point that I would question about this, whether it's America or here, and that is that inclusion is absolutely essential. It has to be central in your model. It just has to be. I just happen to be an albino, and I had problems at the institute for them to make bigger pieces of print to actually actually read it. And in the end, I had to fight a position all the time as a student there. Now, that was quite important because I was SEN, special educational needs leader in my authority. So I ended up that I wrote a paper about inclusion, and it meant that it was important to me, and I ended up writing a book about TAs and stuff like that. So I did get positive things from doing an EDD, and but if you don't look at inclusion, and if it's not in central, I'm afraid to say, whatever model you write, I know I'm being strong about this, but it's not just me. There's quite a few professors have been talking to me about this. Inclusion is essential, and it's not a side-on thing. It's got to be central. So
okay,
I would say that to you.
Thank you, Steve. Jill, your thoughts on how you ensure inclusion in the scholarly practitioners who are doing your programs?
I think in many ways that is, diversity, equity, and inclusion has been a big issue in the United States. And over the last 5 years, many of our institutions have worked much stronger to be able to bring all kinds of students into all kinds of programs and be very supportive of the kinds of work that they're doing and helping them get through. We often have um, accommodations offices that will support students, and all they simply have to do is file a need for accommodations as faculty. We get notifications, and then we have to adjust our PowerPoints, our slides, our handouts, whatever it is that the student might need. Now, a lot of that has gone under attack under our current federal administration. But what has happened is it doesn't mean we've given it up. Many of our institutions have changed language of those same offices to be um, well-being and support for students so that we're still doing the same kinds of work. And that's why, as part of our framework, the idea of understanding equity, justice, inclusion is foundational in that, because you can't work in education without understanding that people are coming with different needs, different backgrounds, need different kinds of support. So as we think about preparing people as EDDs to go back out into practice, that is one of the ways that we need to focus on, is how do we do that? And so while that has been part of our framework, we've often thought about, we mention it in the framework, but what does that look like actionable in terms of supporting our own students, as well as teaching those students to support their students or constituents in the organizations that they work in? So you are spot on.
Okay, thank you. Just had a question to say, can we have a copy of the PowerPoints?
Absolutely.
Slides? Would that be okay? I'm thinking that perhaps Cynthia could put a link on the web page where the film is going to be. So thank you for that, Jill. Rupert, your question?
Oh, thank you, Helen. Yeah, that was really fascinating. I work on the EdD program that Steve mentioned at the IOE. I teach on a few of the modules there, and I supervise 4 EdDs currently. We call them EdDs here, not EDDs. And I want to disagree with you substantially, even though I admire everything that you put out in front of us. So I don't know if it's the case in the States, but here, level 8 is level 8. EdDs and PhDs have to reach the same standard.
Yes.
Yeah.
The same intellectual academic standard.
Yeah.
And so my job is to make them reach that, help them to reach that standard. Now, I fully appreciate, and my colleague Doreen, who I work with closely on this, is an absolute is a strong advocate for accentuating the difference between PhD and EdD programs, and would resonate with many of the themes that you've brought up here. My concern is that the way that you presented them seemed somewhat binary, in saying PhDs are like this, EdDs are like this. And the consequences of presenting them in that way is that you're not expecting intellectual rigor from your EdDs. You're not expecting them to publish academic articles. Mine do.
Yes, that's right.
And surely framing it in that, not all of them, but many, and surely the problem potentially with framing it in that way is that you're saying that intellectual rigor is either optional or less important. And so I want to, and of course, I'm sure you wouldn't take it that way, but I'd also, on the flip side, I have many PhD students who are practitioners undertaking action research, all of those things, and they might not appreciate being told that this was their lane. Can I make a different suggestion then about how that are is the framework and the distinctions that you point out, are they something more like representative of the median forms of engagement of doctoral students on different paths, rather than rules or targets for how they should engage?
Thank you. Okay, over to you, Jill.
Okay, that is a good question. Let me start with the notion of intellectual rigor. By no means are we saying that these are less intellectually rigorous. In fact, I believe we apply the idea that they are more intellectually rigorous, because not only are students having to learn about problems in practice in the same way that a PhD or a researcher might study the problem, or the issue or the concept, but they then have to do something about it, right? They have to take that knowledge and actually do something in practice with it. So it's taking that next step in the work that they do. I'm not saying they don't publish articles. Many do. But the kind of work that they're doing is not knowledge for generalizable or broader knowledge understanding. The studies that they do are much more localized. So the impact you see more locally than in terms of saying this knowledge will scale up and work elsewhere. But students still completely publish the work that they do, a lot of times in practitioner journals, but often in fact, our journal even allows for student publications as well. So I don't want to say by any means, because that is one of the issues that the EDD faced, was that it was considered less than the PhD because it was treated that way by faculty who said, oh, you just want to go into practice, so your dissertation doesn't have to be that good. And we have fought back on that, saying, no, it has to be that good because the kind of work that they're doing has an impact on real people. It shapes their own understanding of how those problems are playing out. So they can certainly publish. Their dissertations ultimately become much more actionable in terms of publications that can take many forms, whether they're professional presentations in scholarly journals or practitioner journals, executive reports that go on to committees. So they're sharing their knowledge in a broader audience than maybe just doing a scholarly journal. So I think the idea is not that it is intellectually less than, it is different in the same way that someone gets an MD who goes into practice versus someone who gets a PhD in biochemistry. Those are two very different jobs. We do not think of one as less than the other, but in the United States, we often think of the EDD as being less than the PhD. And what we're saying is, no, they're actually equal. Their roles are different. We have seen, and part of the problem as to how we got to where we are, is we saw a lot of practitioners in PhD programs, and they were in there simply because they were told, oh, the EDD isn't valued. Go get a PhD. What we're trying to say now is if you want to become a content expert on I have a PhD. If you want to be an expert on an EDD or on program design or higher education, go spend a lifetime studying that with your PhD. If you want to learn how to take those skills of gathering data, analyzing data, synthesizing those data, and then doing something with those data because you want to remain in a practice setting, then an EDD is the better degree for you. It does feel binary. And the reason it has been that way is because it has been so confused for almost 100 years that separating those out in clear distinctions in the same way an MD and a PhD are distinct is kind of the way we had to go, right? People still do whatever they want. There's still going to be people who are going to get whatever degree they want. And ultimately, we have no ultimate control over what happens at every institution, right? But we want to strengthen the EDD in ways that practitioners understand this is giving them skills that they can continue to use in practice.
Okay, thank you. Denise, you wanted to give an account of your experience?
Hi, everyone. So I live in the United Arab Emirates. I completed my PhD, not actually DED, sorry, in West London University. And I went for the ED for first reason was because I wanted to stay as a practitioner within the actual education system. And I wanted to, now I don't know you're from United States, right? I don't know whether you have this 2-tier program where the first 2 years are modular and then the next 2 years are focused only on the dissertation. So ours is, mine was like that. So all my modules, I learned a lot of skills through that. You know, whether we've used SPSS, whether we've used Vivo, whether we've even used different types of research methods, whatever we've done. And then we did the dissertation. The one thing that I was a bit skeptical of what you're saying is I do understand that, yes, there is a bit of a slight difference between the ED and the PhD when it comes to the actual framework. I do understand that because I feel like It's really preparing you in the education system from all aspects. But however, the one thing I was a bit skeptical is when it comes to publications, because I feel I am more prepared to publish now than ever because of the experience that I've gained. And I find, I know I might be, I don't know whether there are PhDs here, but I find that when you're just looking at a PhD of a specific to gain knowledge on a specific theme, whatever it is, as you said, design, whatever it is, I feel like it's a bit of a restriction sometimes because it doesn't give that breadth that you can elaborate even through the modules that you even learn through. And I mean, I say the truth. I've got so much experience now and I've published so much. And I cannot say that Eddie did not prepare me to publish. Okay. I even published with my supervisors, 2 articles. And in fact, I published in America as well. I mean, I think it gives you the fundamental skills for it. And I think we should embrace the ED in a way where, especially when it comes to education, I do understand that there are, PhDs in education, but I still believe the framework of the ED is more in line and more inclined to prepare professors, prepare even, like you said, superintendents, whoever they are, or for example, the head teacher or whoever, with a lot of breadth, skills and knowledge,
Okay.
That's my take.
Thank you, Denise. Jill?
I think, what I'm hearing here is a common theme is this idea is that one needs to be published when they have a doctorate. And I would step back and say, sure, you can publish with an EDD, and we've seen many of our students do that. Um, in fact, I wrote a book with several of the students who published based on their action research work that they did. So the idea is not that they cannot publish, but the ultimate goal is not publication. The ultimate goal is to teach them how to use that knowledge to improve and lead in practice. So if the terminal degree is meant to teach someone to transform practice, publication may not be the way to do that in practitioner settings, but teaching them how to go through an action research process or understanding systems change through improvement science or evaluating whether or not the programs that they continue to administer in their organizational settings are having an impact in creating change for students who are suffering, then those are real skills that they can continue to use over and over. So the distinction here is where does the value on publication fit for someone who wants to remain in a practice setting? I'm not by any means saying that they cannot publish. I'm not saying that they aren't trained to be able to publish, but that is not the primary goal of EDD programs, at least here in the United States. I did put in the chat when I responded to Rupert, one of our colleagues two of our colleagues actually at Western Carolina University have studied quite a bit on this idea, what do we mean by rigor in EDD programs, and focused it on the idea that teaching people to apply research to be more equitable and just in their leadership settings is the definition of rigor. So I would invite you to take a look at that as well. But the idea being is that publication is not the end all be all for the majority of practitioners.
Okay, thank you. We've not got any more questions in the list of in the chat. I was going to ask a question, if you don't mind, Jill. You presented in your slides an example of a principal who took the theory of instructional leadership and then developed it, and you had a list of, I recall, I think the kind of key features of instructional leadership. Have I got that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think what troubles me about that is that if that principal was my doctoral student, whether on a PhD or on RAD at Manchester, I would not encourage them to make instructional leadership work better in practice. I'd encourage them to actually blow it apart and design something new and different. And to do that, you would have to locate in the social sciences, whereby you're able, for example, to draw on theories of power, theories of the human condition, whatever it is, and also to question notions of leadership, particularly what's talked about in terms of educational or instructional leadership that's got nothing actually to do with education. And I think for me, the issue is whether or not the approach to a scholarly practitioner means that people become technologists of leadership models rather than critical researchers who are theorizers. We talk about our professionals who do doctorates as researching professionals. In other words, they're not just practitioners who do a technological job, they're actually professionals with codes of conduct who are very knowledgeable, very experienced, but they're also researchers. They're concerned to produce new and innovative knowledge. And I just got troubled by the idea that, because I've got a bee in my bonnet at the moment about instructional leadership. And I certainly am deeply concerned by professionals who seem to present themselves as knowers because they're speaking the current language, the current fad and fashion. I would want to blow that out the water. Does your EdD allow you to do that?
I think you were absolutely spot on. And I think the example that I showed, I'm not part of that program, so I don't know the full story of that student, is exactly what that has done. By exposing practitioners to the literature that we know exists out there, you are teaching them to blow up their very systematic thinking and what they know, which largely comes from learning on the job and less from training that they've had, right? Education in general does not have a very systematic training process beyond becoming a teacher. And so, yes, exactly. Many students end up doing reading the whatever MBA language or book that's hot topic on leadership that's out there and throwing buzzwords. But if we can bring these folks into programs and expose them to the literature that exists out there on a particular topic that they are interested in, and combine that, marry that with what they know happens on the ground, that's where we teach them to grow and become better leaders in helping them think through theories and how those theories can be applied, and thinking through what they've read through studies that have happened in different settings and what that means for their localized context and how they can shift and change that to be able to do something. I think you're absolutely spot on. That's our job as faculty, is to show them these amazing skills of bodies of literature, of how to gather data, how to analyze data so that it gives you true understanding of what's happening in a situation. I will say here in the United States, one of the struggles we have run against in teaching people to use literature is that once they've left the university, they no longer have access to the literature. And so here we've taught them to use literature in informing their thinking and actions. And then oftentimes we don't let them get back into that literature. So they have to find it on Google Scholar and potentially pay to get it. That's a quest I've been trying to deal with at many universities, including my own.
Okay, thank you very much. Colleagues, we're coming to a close now. On your behalf, can I thank Jill for an incredibly thought-provoking talk today that I think has probably raised a number of issues that I look forward to chatting with Jill about at a forthcoming Belmas conference. I hope you're going to come back in the future, Jill, into the UK and possibly to other European conferences to be able to sit down with a coffee and have a long chat and work our way through many of the issues that I think are there in the presentation you gave. And we've just begun to kind of uncover many of the important points that we need to talk through in the questions that have been raised. I think it's been really significant that you've been involved. This project's been going for so long across so many universities. And I think it's important that we have the learning from this, the connections and links that you've provided so that we can continue the conversation. So thank you so much, Jill, for a really thought-provoking, interesting and important talk. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you for joining us and looking forward to seeing you all at future events. Thank you to Cynthia and colleagues in the Belmas office for all the excellent work that they've done in setting up today's event. Thank you, Jill. Have a good day, Jill. It's just after breakfast.
Everybody.
So
Thank
have a
you.
good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.